Good evening. Welcome to a special edition of our live Facebook question and answer forum hosted by the Stanislaus County Office of Emergency Services. I'm Linda Muma with Stan OES.
And I'm Amy Vickery, Public Information Officer for Stanislaus County. With protests continuing around the nation and some here at home, we understand everyone has strong feelings and opinions about what is happening. That's why we decided to focus tonight's live broadcast on recent demonstrations and local response. It's an opportunity for our community to participate in an open dialogue.
While COVID-19 is still present in our community and we are asking everyone to continue to do their part to prevent the spread of the disease, we also want to create a space to have a meaningful conversation about the current protests and civil unrest within our community.
In an effort to keep this discussion constructive, we are asking that our viewers please be respectful tonight in the comments and questions. And remember that we have a 5-comment maximum per viewer in order to prevent spamming and give everyone the opportunity to contribute to the dialogue.
Tonight's panelists are Modesto Clergy Council Correspondent Darius Crosby, Stanislaus County Sheriff Jeff Dirkse, and Modesto Police Chief Galen Carrol. Let's start with Sheriff Jeff Dirkse. Sheriff, what are your thoughts on the recent protests surfacing in cities throughout the country?
Yeah, obviously there are hundreds and hundreds of protests going on across our country as a result of the tragedy in Minneapolis. And you have thousands, if not millions of Americans who are very upset by this, as they well should be. And, you know, the vast majority of these folks that are out there protesting, they want to be heard, and rightfully so. And so we fully support that. I think anyone in law enforcement, we have a duty, a sworn duty to protect our Constitution, and we absolutely protect that right for them to voice their opinion. And again, talk about the frustrations and the challenges that our country has faced over the last several years and bring that to the forefront. Unfortunately, what we've seen with a lot of these protests is that criminal acts and violence have made their way into them by a very, very small number of individuals who are involved. And quite frankly, I think that detracts from the legitimacy of the message that's out there. And it creates a lot of chaos around the conversation that needs to happen, and I think that that's very unfortunate. So I would say that for anyone that's out there, if you want to have your voice, by all means, go to one of these events. Let your voice be heard. But for those bad actors that are out there who want to mar these protests by criminal activity or violence, stay home. Otherwise, you're going to force law enforcement to take the actions that we need to take to protect our community.
You may have just answered this question, but what would you say is the most pressing concern for residents of our county?
I think that right now, specifically here in Stanislaus County, obviously we have had a couple of fairly large protests. One in Modesto earlier this week on Sunday, and then there was one in Oakdale this afternoon. We are aware of several others that are coming up over the weekend. And so there are a lot of people who both want to participate so that they can be heard, but also who are concerned because of some of that violence that they have seen out there. And we in law enforcement are well aware of that. We are doing everything that we can to make sure that these are peaceful events. Again, we are there not to prevent the protest, but to protect the protesters and to protect our community. We want to see these things happen, and we want to see them happen safely. So that is where the concern with the public is. When they see these images of looting and violence, that creates fear, and I will tell you that we are doing everything in our power to prevent that.
Let's go next to Police Chief Galen Carrol with the same question. What are your thoughts on the recent protests surfacing in cities throughout the country? And then also, if you could tell us, what is your most pressing concern for residents of the city of Modesto?
So I think anybody that has seen that video and anybody that's seen what happened to George Floyd is upset and is angry, and rightfully so. Those in law enforcement are also upset. That should have never happened. And it can't be taken back. And Mr. Floyd's family, we can't replace him to the family. We can't replace him to the community and to others. So we understand that there is anger in the community. There's anger across the nation. We completely understand that. The protests that we had on Sunday was largely peaceful. There were words being thrown out and things like that, but the protesters themselves took care of the protests as a whole. So my thoughts on the protests, it's a starting point. It seems like 20, 30 years ago, it feels like we had this same dialogue, and it shouldn't be reoccurring, but it seems to be reoccurring. And so this is a starting point for the dialogue. I can't wait for the time when we can stop throwing things at each other and actually start sitting down and having that dialogue. And I think that's where we're at as a nation, is we need to take a step back and allow that opportunity to have that dialogue. And so my most pressing concern for Modesto, we have 2 additional events coming up, one on Friday night, which is a candlelight vigil. I will be there and be participating. There's another one on Saturday, which again is a rally. It's not intended to be, I don't think, a protest, but more of a rally and a vigil. I'll be there at that as well. And our hope is that those are peaceful. Peaceful doesn't mean they're not loud, but that they're peaceful with no acts of violence. And the organizers who I've talked to as well want that also. We do have to protect the downtown. We do have to protect our city, and we will protect our city. But we also have to protect the protesters and those that want their voices heard.
Before we get to our next guest, I'm going to go back to the sheriff just because this is a timely issue that just came about today. The county issued a state of emergency today. Why was that step taken, and what does that mean for our community?
Yeah, so a state of emergency is something that we do whenever there is something really, quite frankly, out of the ordinary that requires a lot of attention, a lot of special resources, and a lot of dedicated effort to it. Obviously, we did that both locally and at the state level for COVID-19, and we did that as well for the current situation that we're facing around some of these protest rallies. We've already had 2 fairly significant events in the county. We do expect many more this weekend. And by declaring the state of emergency, that does a few things as far as allowing us as law enforcement to share resources more easily. It does give certain authorities, specifically in the case of the Sheriff's Department, where my custodial staff under a state of emergency can do more out on the street. So it gives us a much larger pool to draw from to keep our community safe. And that was one of the big reasons that I pushed for it. Just as we look to the future and we look to the next few days, it's having that pool of our own local resources to address this issue. Now, a lot of folks have asked about a curfew. A state of emergency would allow us to enact a curfew if we felt it was needed. But all of our law enforcement leaders are in regular contact multiple times a day. You probably can't see it the way this is portrayed, but Galen is sitting right next to me, and 6 feet apart. But we have text threads, we have email threads, we talk to each other all the time. And that is important because we are constantly communicating, and we are all in agreement that we do not want a curfew unless we think it's absolutely important for keeping our community safe. So there is no curfew in Stanislaus County at this time. It may come, I will be honest, it's written, it's prepared. That way, in the event that we feel it's appropriate, we can request that it be enacted, but it's not here right now, and we collectively do not want to place that restriction on the public unless we think it's absolutely imperative to keep our community safe.
Thank you, Sheriff. Let's go to Reverend Darius Crosby. Darius, thank you for joining us this evening.
You bet.
You are here representing the Clergy Council. What is the Clergy Council? Who's involved, and what do you do?
Well, with the Clergy Council, we exist, first of all, there are 40 pastors and ministry leaders involved in it. It exists as a liaison between the community and law enforcement. That's number one. It should be said as a preface that this group does not exist as a cheerleader for law enforcement, and neither does law enforcement exist as a cheerleader for the Clergy Council. It is a vital relationship that has been established, and we have the opportunity to go through Clergy Academy, to get behind the badge and experience some of the split-second decisions police officers have to make and things of that nature. We go through a process to make us familiar with what the police are doing. That relationship is already in place. We don't have to wait till things happen to try and establish a line of communication, and it's already there. So we exist for that purpose, and it now includes all three branches of law enforcement: Sheriff's Department, Police Department, and Highway Patrol. It also includes, over the last 7 years, well, it'll be 7 years in August, it has developed to where it includes the District Attorney's Office, Mayor's Office, School Board Superintendent, and the list goes on. And so that's who we are, but we are the liaison between departments, all these gatekeepers, and the community. We're required to have relationships within the community to be able to be of service in the place that I just noted.
This is obviously a very important and dedicated group of volunteers. Why do we need a clergy council, and what are your goals?
Well, in any community, just like in life, you have in many cases, a gap between groups of people, between entities. And the police, law enforcement is no different. In any community, there can exist a gap. And what causes these gaps is there is a cause for hostility that creates the gap. And that cause could be anything. It could be lack of communication, lack of knowledge of things, or whatever the case may be. I'll give you one prime example with the Law Enforcement Youth Summit that we started about 4 years ago. What we learned that in interviewing 100 youth that had what they considered a bad experience with law enforcement, we found out 85 of them had never met a police officer of any kind. So we sought to create events and allow them to come to the council meetings once a month to come and meet officers, take pictures or whatever the case may be, decreasing the fear that goes before them. And if you're stopped by an officer on the street, it has already given you some ease, because that uniform does not represent always what people tell you it does. Now you got your own firsthand experience with it. And so those kinds of things, again, we have the opportunity to be involved in whatever way we can to improve and maintain the quality of life for everybody in our county.
Thank you, Darius. That's great information. I'd like to go now to Chief Carrol. We understand that you started the MPD Clergy Council when you became the Modesto Chief of Police. Can you describe what it is and really why you wanted to bring this to Modesto?
Yeah, so briefly, at first, we're all human beings. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, we're all human beings. We all want a safe place to live and to work and to raise our families and to have opportunities. And that is across the board. Different communities have different issues. I can't see through someone else's eyes unless I sit down and get to know them. And so when I was in Long Beach, we had a couple different groups. There wasn't an official clergy council. We did have different groups in Long Beach that we met with on a regular basis. And so when I came up here, I met with several of the pastors, including Darius Crosby and the late Reverend Anderson, and we began talking about even just having a Chief's Advisory panel that I could bounce things off of, that I could show body cam footage to, or if we had complaints, that someone could go through them if they didn't feel comfortable coming through us. And so Darius is pretty humble, but Darius was part or had family member that was part of setting one up in Los Angeles. And I think he had been hoping to do that here for quite a while. And so we saw it as a perfect opportunity to do that. And so we made it official and brought it to council and had it blessed by the council. But again, it is not just a mouthpiece for the police department. And there have been multiple times when they've called me after hours about incidents that have happened in our community. And they have asked some very, very hard questions. And I have shown them videos and things that the public did not get to see, to help answer their questions. And so they hold us accountable, and I appreciate their counsel, and I appreciate their tough questions, because lots of times they ask us very tough questions.
It appears we're getting a lot of questions about law enforcement, but I wanted to go back to you, Darius, because you have a really interesting story. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you chose to get involved in the Clergy Council?
Well, my story goes a bit back. I am a victim of police brutality twice in my life, and sadly one of those was in middle school and the other one was while I was a student at Fresno State. When the one happened in middle school, when 1980 came, they were putting athletes together to go across the world to express our athletic prowess, if you will, here in this country. And so I was chosen as one of those athletes to go over to South America. The challenge there is I was still bitter and angry. I was going to have on a uniform that says USA, and I hated USA because of what had happened to me, and no one did anything. But my father, I will always remember talking with him, and he told me something that broke my heart. He says, one of these days I'm going to die. He said, I need you to make up your mind before you get on the airplane that you're going to take out of here, whether you're going to be on the side of the solution or the side of the problem. And I promised him that I was going to be on the side of the solution after he explained to me what that entailed. And I did go over there, and I had the opportunity, and this is not bragging, but I won a gold medal. And I stood on that platform in tears, thinking about what my father told me. And I thank God for that. But that's how I got involved.
Thank you for that story. Wow. Sheriff, let's go to you next. A lot of people are on tonight because they're curious about the protests and the demonstrations, and we know your office, as you mentioned before, was involved in the downtown Modesto incident. Today in Oakdale, you were also involved with that protest, as well as other law enforcement agencies. Can you tell us a little bit about the protest in Oakdale, how it went today? And then also, people are curious about how mutual aid works, when you know what is needed by a different agency, and then do you expect the National Guard to send forces here if this continues?
Okay, that was a lot of questions in one, so let me kind of start a little bit maybe from the top, and we'll work our way down. So through the Office of Emergency Services, we have the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, which is what throughout COVID-19 the public has become very familiar with how that process works. This production that you're seeing tonight, this Facebook Live, is kind of a result of the public outreach portion of that of the EOC. And so what we have done now in light of the protests is we have activated the EOC to help us coordinate across all of the various agencies in our county for mutual aid, specifically to address the protests. And again, not the protests, not the people speaking their mind, the concern for violence or crime that might come out of that. And so the EOC is involved, and we have what's called a unified command. And with that unified command, the chief of police for all of the cities, or myself, if it was to be in the county, we would technically, or our representative, but we would be in charge of managing that incident. And then the other agencies provide a supporting role. So on Monday, the city of Modesto, Chief Carrol and his team, they ran that incident. And the Sheriff's Office and CHP and Turlock and Oakdale and the other organizations, the other agencies across our county, they assist in whatever way is needed. And that's what we did on Sunday, and that's what we did in Oakdale today. Chief Heller, he ran that incident out there, and the Sheriff's Office provided additional staff, as did Modesto Police Department and the Highway Patrol, just to make sure that it is a safe event. And so specific to that event today, I will tell you I was there virtually for the whole thing. Again, 90+% of the people that were there, and there were protesters that were addressing obviously the main concerns, and let's be clear, there were some counter protesters there as well. But 90+% of them, they were all good folks who just wanted to have their voice heard. And then you end up with a few that don't want to just have their voice heard and don't want to just speak. And ultimately today, one party kind of started a fist fight with the other party, and then that escalated. And so all of the various responding agencies stepped in to quell the violence and stop that. And unfortunately, what something like that does is that then ends that what had been a very peaceful activity for several hours, because now it's creating kind of a situation for potentially crime, and we can't allow that to happen to protect our community. And so that ends it. We're forced to disperse everyone. And again, it's unfortunate because there's a lot of folks that they just want to have their voice heard. And I will tell you that throughout the day today, we heard a great deal of appreciation and respect from both sides that were kind of involved in this incident. And I would also like to tell you that we have a great deal of appreciation and respect for a lot of the folks that were organizing this event. There were many individuals that we would interact with, whether it was Chief Heller and his team beforehand or today throughout the course of the event itself. And hey, can you maybe get some folks to stand over here and not block that? Or could we, potentially move this somewhere else, or whatever the case may be? And they were very agreeable and very helpful. And I will just say, I'm not going to speak necessarily for Chief Heller, but we, certainly as the Sheriff's Office, we thank those folks for taking their leadership role in making that a peaceful event for the most part.
We have a question that came in from Maria, and it's a question that probably all three of you could answer. I'll start with you first, Sheriff. What more can be done to rebuild increased trust with our diverse community? What steps can be taken to promote a greater sense of connection to the public?
Well, I think probably one of the very first things that we all have to remember is we all live in this community together. And I'm not going to give one of Darius's sermons for him, but I've heard this a number of times from him, and I think that it makes a lot of sense. Depending on your outlook of how the human race started, but if you believe in the Bible and Adam and Eve, that started with two people. Darius, I might mess this up, but we are all 1/70th cousins or something like that. Yes. And I say that because we are all part of this same community, and we are all at some level family here. And so it's important that we all realize that and start there. Let's face it, no one is ever happy to deal with law enforcement. Maybe you're getting a ticket, no one is happy about that. If your house got broken into, no one is happy about that. But we are here to do a role in our community and keep it as safe as we possibly can. So there has to be just this understanding that we are all in this together. We also have to realize that everyone comes from a different perspective and a different outlook. And those outlooks, how you were raised, what you were brought up in, what neighborhood you came from, or what school you went to, that will drive how you view the world. And when you go sit down with someone that you are not used to talking to, or maybe they come from the wrong side of the tracks or from a demographic that you didn't have a lot of experience with, you will ultimately realize we're all very, very similar, and we all very much want the same thing. So, one, realize that we're all in this community together. Realize that at the end, a lot of us want the same thing, and communicate. One of the major challenges that we face, I think, as a society, this is not unique to law enforcement or anything else, is social media. And I'm going to pick on that specifically because so many rumors swirl around on social media about this group, that group, these politics, those politics, some ideology. But when you actually sit down and talk to someone from that group or that ideology, again, I'll go back to, you realize that we're all kind of here together and we all want the same thing. And with that, you can do a lot of that through groups. So we've talked about the Clergy Council. Galen and the team and the clergy have started that. I am a member of that through no good idea of my own, and I do appreciate their support. But our ability to interact with them and the clergy with us, we all get smarter and better because of it. And those type of events allow us all to serve our community better.
Thank you, Sheriff. Chief Carrol, same question to you. What more can be done to rebuild and increase trust with our diverse community? What steps can be taken to promote a greater sense of connection to the public?
So a couple things. One is sometimes it's frustrating to hear that question. And the reason it's frustrating is I understand there needs to be greater outreach. However, many times the same people come to Coffee with a Cop or come to our town hall meetings or come to a lot of our events. It's the same people over and over again. And so we all get busy in our lives and we forget to make those connections. I can tell you that at the police department, we've been doing things in schools for the last several years. Officers themselves have come up with programs like Beyond the Walls, where they go and counsel kids that, quite frankly, have parents that are in prison. And they let them know that it's just a bad decision, that their parent's not a bad person, it's just a bad decision. And they try to work with them. And we have another one that's Save Me a Seat, where officers were going into schools and just having lunch with kids. The Clergy Council had come up with a youth summit, and that again was a way just to get our youth and officers together. And so there are a lot of ways that we try to connect. We need to continue to try to connect, but it's also a two-way street. And so I'm not going to take the responsibility away from us to reach out, but it's also a responsibility of our residents to be involved and even just get to know your neighbor. And how many of us don't even know our neighbors, so that we can have these type conversations. And like Jeff said, we all live here. Unlike most cities in this country, the police officers and the deputies live here, and they work here, and they grew up here, and they have families here. And so that's something that's unique to Modesto and to Stanislaus County, and it's something we need to continue to build on. And build on those relationships. And then just one last thing, so I don't get too wordy. One of the things that I tell all the officers that I hire, and we repeat it to officers very often, and it's one of our core values, which is I expect every officer that works for the Modesto Police Department to treat people like they'd want their family treated. And the exact speech that I give them is that doesn't mean that sometimes we don't have to raise our voice. That doesn't mean sometimes we don't have to use force. But when it's over, it's over. We brush them off. We get them medical aid if we need to, and we explain what's going on. And that goes along with just those quick values that we hire on and we promote on and we look to instill in the department. And that's a servant's heart, which goes back to treating people like your family. A courageous spirit, which is not physical courage. It is moral courage to do the right thing and to stop people when they're doing something wrong, which would have gone a long way in Minneapolis, and George Floyd would not be dead if they had moral courage to stand up and do the right thing. And then a relentless drive to continue to improve. And so that relentless drive, we need to continue to prove to reach out to the community and really bond with them.
Reverend Crosby, would you like to weigh in as well? And I can repeat the question for you from Maria. What more can be done to rebuild or increase trust with our diverse community and promote a greater sense of connection to the public?
Well, one thing that is absolutely true is what you've heard from Chief Carrol and what you've heard from Sheriff Dirkse is that one string in each of our three guitars, one string. We are family, and that's one of the things when we set up the youth summit, we asked the kids prior to if they had any questions that they wanted to ask Chief Carrol. They had several questions, and I met him in his office to deliver those questions prior to even doing it. And the one question that he took was, from one youth was, what has to happen for all these things that are going on that are hurting people and all this all over the country and all over everywhere? What is going to have to happen? And Chief's response was, he took a deep sigh and he says, we're just going to have to learn to view everybody as family. And there goes that one string in the guitar. It's going to start with that, family. We've got to be able to view people as family. If you pull over someone and that person is old enough to be your mother, then for all practical purposes, I'm getting ready to deal with mother here. The other thing is, this is another broken record. It's skipping, so you'll hear it a lot, and that is, we encourage all police officers, when you go out, take two measures of your opportunity to serve the public. One of them is, in fact, to police. That is one of them. but it is also to rescue. And if you don't put those two together, something bad is going to happen. So we're encouraging them to just keep those two things in mind. Lastly, I'll say this. We're going to have to do more to bring the different races of people together for events and things of that nature, to get people the opportunity to remove the cause for hostility between us. It won't get better until we learn to do that and increase what we're already doing.
We'll stick with you, Darius, for a moment, because you had some really good contributions about how to rebuild trust and build stronger relationships. But right now there's so much justified anger about the death of George Floyd. We've talked about that across the nation. Because you work closely with law enforcement, I'm sure you have a unique perspective on this, but what is your opinion about what needs to happen to prevent this type of horrific death from ever happening again?
Well, and then one of them, you can go right back to the not only police, but rescue. If that had played more of a role in this situation, we might have George Floyd with us, and that's my opinion. But the other thing I should say is that when I was in high school, about 16 or 17 years old, I participated in an essay contest, and the title of the essay that I wrote was "Freedom Demands Responsibility." There are a lot of things that we may have the right to do, to protest, to do this or that, but there are guidelines to that. If we're going to do something, we really do have to make sure that we don't just misuse our freedom to do it, but think of the family that we're serving out of. And that has to become our consciousness, that we can't just say, well, this is my right, this is my right. And I'm not against rights. I really am for rights. But all I'm saying is, once again, freedom, it actually demands responsibility, or it ceases to be freedom. Lastly, you got, we see oftentimes we serve with dignity and respect, but there's one that I throw in. You also serve each other on both sides, community, police, whatever the case may be. You serve with integrity, because dignity has to do with what's going on, what you do when the body cam is on or when someone has a cell phone. But integrity has to do with what you have the propensity to do, even if no one can record what you're doing. It's something that's in your heart that we need to work on.
We'll stick with you for just a moment, because we gave both of our law enforcement officials an opportunity to answer this question. I want to give you an opportunity as well. What is the Clergy Council saying about the protests, including some of the looting and rioting?
The interesting thing about the Clergy Council now is it has evolved to a place where we have email. They're getting ready to set up social media and all that stuff, and there's a Clergy Council phone number. You would find that there's a phrase that I've gotten in answering that phone whenever I answer it. It's a majority now, and that phrase is simply this: two wrongs don't make a right. Two wrongs don't make a right, and we get in that over and over and over again. And that's where the Clergy Council is with it. It's not one group against the other or anything of that nature. As a believer in God, I believe we're all dropped down here on this planet to not leave this world the way we found it. And if we're going to take advantage of someone's tragedy to go out and do things, we run into a problem there. So two wrongs don't make a right. That's where we are right now.
Thank you, Darius. Let's talk a little bit about last weekend's protest, and we'll go to Chief Carrol on this one. Last weekend, we know more than 1,000 people participated in the George Floyd protest that started and ended in downtown Modesto. The protest was mostly peaceful, but by the end, there were some arrests. Can you tell us how many people were arrested and what sorts of charges were attached to those arrests?
Sure. There were 14 arrests total. And of those 14 arrests, just because I know there's another question about it, 12 of those residents were from Modesto. One was from Ceres and one was from Stockton. My understanding is one of the individuals arrested in Oakdale today was one of the ones we arrested on Sunday. So he came out to do it again. Most of those charges were for failing to disperse or obstructing an officer. One of the most serious charges, which I will say bothered me the most, was there was an individual in the crowd carrying a 3-year-old, maybe 4-year-old, throwing things at officers, trying to incite the crowd while holding that child as a shield. That individual was arrested, and he was charged with child endangerment, and he will get follow-up as far as his parenting skills, because that's not something you should do, bring a 3-year-old to a child or to a protest, and then get involved in throwing things at officers or trying to incite things. So the charges, they were mainly there to get people to leave or to remove them from the situation to help calm it down.
We'll go to the sheriff next. The handful of the protesters that were arrested in Modesto last weekend that were just mentioned, and they were placed in your jail. Will these people be released on zero bail? This is a question that came in as a direct message.
Yeah, the vast majority of them would be if they're misdemeanor arrests, other than the child endangerment, which would not be a zero bail. But the other 13 or 14, whatever the number was, they should all, as far as I'm aware, be zero bail charges.
Follow-up question for you, Sheriff, that came in as a direct message. Are those released on zero bail out for good, or will they be recalled to incarceration as part of the reopening phases? And when will zero bail be lifted?
So if they're out on zero bail, for anyone who makes bail, whether it's zero bail or before, and when we had a bail schedule, that doesn't mean that your case goes away. It's not like you buy off your case and that's gone. You still have to go through the court process. So if the DA files charges and maybe there's no deal arranged between the DA's office and the public defender and the accused, then it will go to court and it'll go through a trial process. And then if someone is found guilty, then they would, of course, have to potentially come back to jail. Depends on what the sentence would be. And if they're found not guilty, then obviously they wouldn't come back to jail. So for those that are released on zero bail, their legal process is not over. Assuming, again, that the DA has filed charges on them, and she has for many different zero bail crimes, then they will still have to be held accountable for whatever actions they are accused of and go through the legal process. So many of them would ultimately potentially come back into custody, assuming that they were found guilty, and many will not if they're either not, if there are no charges pressed or if they're found not guilty.
This next question is for Reverend Crosby. This came in from Brooke. Brooke is asking, what advice do you give parents when speaking to their children about police brutality, the protest, and civil unrest?
Well, again, I'll have to go back to the relational side of things. I am encouraging parents, regardless of the situation, to seek opportunities for those young people to meet officers face to face. I mean, there are a lot of things I can offer, but that right there is a foundation for me. It has made a lot of changes in people's lives. There is a photo, my granddaughter is 3 years old now, but there's a photo of her 9 months old at my son's house now. The chief of police is holding her in his arms, and she's picking at his badge. For some reason, her disposition towards law enforcement is looking back on that photo. And that's a simple thing, but I'm saying I just encourage parents back to the family thing. I don't want kids growing up the way I spent the latter part of my teenage years in hatred because of what happened to me and what I was experiencing on the streets. So relationship is what I encourage.
Thank you, Darius. Next question is for the sheriff. Angel has asked this evening, can we get help from the National Guard, not for protesters, but the rioters affecting our businesses?
The shortest answer is yes, we could potentially do that. But I would tell you that at this time, there's no need for us to ask for that type of assistance. Earlier, I spoke about one of the values of the state of emergency, and that was allowing me to do some different things with my custodial deputies, which allows me to use them out on the streets in certain capacities, which gives us, in general terms, another 300 staff members that we can deploy across the county for various things. Now, we still have to operate the jail, and they're still busy in there, but it just gives us a much larger pool to draw from. And we'd also kind of spoken earlier about the mutual aid aspect, and so part of what we do at the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, is we track all of our available resources in the county. And that's from every agency. And so we do that specifically so that if there is an issue in one of our communities or another, we can shift resources around the county. So by way of longer answer, I would say there's no need at this time for the National Guard. It is an available resource if we need to request something like that from the state, but I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Next question is for the chief. And this is a direct message, I believe. It was rumored that many of the protesters on social media were not from this area. What information can you tell us about the hometowns of those who participated in the march and those who were arrested?
Yes, I'd mentioned that previously. Of the 14 arrests, the 12 were from Modesto, one was from Stockton, and one was from Ceres. So it's our own hometown folks that are voicing their displeasure, and I would fully expect that. Others, why would you leave your own city to just voice or to, your displeasure, voice your displeasure? Sorry.
Okay, next question. What surprised you about the protest on Sunday?
I think what the first surprise right up front was the sheer number of people. It was a lot larger than I expected. The pleasant surprise was that, for the most part, again, it was very loud. There were things that were being called, officers were being called that I have never heard before. So there was some creativity in the name calling and things like that. But again, that's the anger that people were feeling. But for the most part, the organizers kept it peaceful. They tried to keep those in line that were trying to make it something that they didn't intend. And so the size was probably the biggest surprise. The only other surprise that I had, and that I hope in future protests or rallies that those organizing those marches, when you put out on Facebook or you put out on social media to all wear the same color clothing, to cover your tattoos, to do things like that, that is only to give people anonymity, to allow those that want to do damage into a crowd into that crowd. And so if you're a peaceful protester, you don't need to wear all black. You don't need to wear the same color. You don't need to wear the same color masks. There's no reason for that. And quite frankly, the police are not looking to arrest everybody at a protest. They're looking at those people that are trying to provoke it to be something that it's not. We simply don't have the manpower to try and arrest everybody. So biggest surprise was probably that. That was asked as the organizers to wear all black or all the same color. But hopefully in the future that is a lesson learned. And so to our community, thank you. Thank you for largely being peaceful. To the 99.9% of the people that were there, we appreciate it. And I can tell you I was in on an arrest of an individual, and members of the crowd surrounded us and kept the crowd back. It doesn't mean there wasn't things being thrown, but members of the crowd stepped in and kept people back. And that was not necessarily surprising, but it was very happy to see. And so I am happy the way that Modesto voices its anger. And we don't have a burned out downtown. I don't think we're going to have a burned out downtown. And so I'm just happy with the way Modesto voices its anger.
We'll stick with you for one more question. Arena asked, what was the reason for involving SWAT in the Modesto protest on Sunday?
So I think it's a misconception that SWAT was involved. The officers that came out in the, we call them turtle suits, they may have looked like SWAT. They are actually trained in mobile field force. I will tell you, and I will tell the community, you will not see those officers out from the Modesto Police Department unless we need to take action. I don't want those officers out in front of a crowd. I don't want them around a crowd. I think they only incite a crowd. And so the reason they were brought out quite frankly, is a car was surrounded, and officers were calling because a car was surrounded, and the crowd was getting very unruly. They were brought out to get that car out of the middle of the crowd. We started taking all kinds of objects at that time, and that's when we started forming up the lines and brought the mobile field force out. At the same time that team came out is when we started making announcements for people to leave. And so for those of you that come to a protest, don't be a looky-loo when you start hearing announcements. Don't stand around to watch, because everybody that stays is subject to arrest. Every single one of the people that stay. And even if you're on the sidewalk and we're trying to clear a street, we're not going to let you behind us. When we go to clear a street, the purpose is to move that crowd forward. And so please, if you're ever in a situation again and you hear the officers making announcements, it's a good time to leave. And if you see the turtle suits come out, at least in Modesto, it's a good time to leave.
One more question for you, because there was a lot of dialogue about this on social media. There was a short video that has gone up on social media from Sunday's protest that shows a man who was pushed down from behind by an officer as they tried to clear downtown, according to what you were just talking about. So a few questions have come in about that incident, asking what happened to cause this and what officers' instructions are regarding use of force in this type of situation. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So I have seen two versions of what occurred. One version is a very short clip that was put out by the local media, very short clip that does not tell the entire story or even close to the entire story. I'll be releasing a body cam footage of what actually occurred either later tonight or tomorrow. And so with that particular incident, there was an individual that when we went to clear the street, we had already declared an emergency or an unlawful assembly. We already asked people to leave. We waited 10 to 15 minutes. We even used flashbangs, which are very loud bangs, to get people to move. A lot of people left. And when officers started walking down the street to clear that street, we had that individual that was in the all red, I believe it is, trying to get behind the lines. And what should have happened if we had enough resources at that time is both of those individuals, both the guy whose back was to the line, and I will argue that he was not trying to comply, because if he was trying to comply, he would have left. What should have happened is they both should have been pulled behind a line, and an arrest team should have arrested both of them. So for the individual whose back was to the officers, I'm happy to meet with him specifically and have a conversation and a dialogue with him. But there's two sides to every story. And when officers are on a line like that and they are moving forward towards you, please leave. That's what we're trying to get you to do.
This next question is for the sheriff. This came in from CK. CK says, for both Chief Carrol and Sheriff Dirkse, so we'll start with Sheriff Dirkse. How many hours of de-escalation training are your officers required to participate in per year during the course of their law enforcement careers? Does this training focus on high emotion, large group situations, as well as individual mental illness cases? What does that training consist of?
Yeah, so we do a lot of training throughout any cop's career. So we'll kind of start at the beginning with the what we call the basic post academy, the basic police academy. State law requires, I think it's 664 hours at the basic post academy, and we do an additional 2 weeks beyond what the minimum requirements are. And during the basic academy, there's covers a variety of topics that are needed to do this profession, but de-escalation, use of force, crisis intervention techniques, they are all part of that. And within that additional 2 weeks, that is also specifically one of the categories that we cover is de-escalation training. We have additional diversity training in that time, driving, use of firearms, and use of force. We focus that additional training on kind of all of our high-risk areas that come into play. And so that's just in the basic post academy. And then specifically for the Sheriff's Department, once someone graduates from that, they clear FTO, the field training program, where they are trained by another deputy, a more senior deputy on the street. We also require that within the first 2 years they go specifically to a crisis intervention techniques course. It's 40 hours. We do it locally here, and it covers a lot of things, specifically around folks with either mental illness or addictions, but there's a lot of de-escalation in that. And then in our, we do it biannually. Every 2 years we do mandatory training. And the state requirement specifically for some of the either the racial training or de-escalation is 5 years, and internal to our organization it's mandatory every 2 years. So we do it far more frequently than is required. And then the other kind of key thing that happens, and this happens every day in law enforcement, we have what we refer to as briefing training. So when the new squad shows up for the day, they get their briefing, their update on what's going on, and they do briefing training. And it could cover anything, but we spent a lot of time focused on things like what we saw in Minneapolis. And with the tragic death of Mr. Floyd, and how we should respond to that, and why you shouldn't do things like what you saw in that video, and what the appropriate techniques are. And that is regular training that happens really throughout the work week. It might not be long, it might be 10 minutes, it might be 30 minutes, it might be 60 minutes. But the point to this is that it's covered throughout an officer or a deputy's career in many different ways. And so, specific, I think, to the question from CK, how many hours in a year, the simplest answer is a lot. And I know that that's probably not the kind of the quantifiable number that he wants, but he can email me, or she, directly through the website. I can send them the training outlines and kind of all the hours and so on. I'm happy to do that. It can also be found on the Post website, and they'll see all of the hours by category that are in there.
Okay, let's go to Chief Carrol with the same question. And I can repeat that if I can find it. For both the chief and sheriff, how many hours of de-escalation training are your officers required to participate in per year during the course of their law enforcement careers? Does this training focus on high emotion, large group situations, as well as individual mental illness cases? What does the training consist of? And then I have a follow-up question for both of you.
So a lot of that answer is going to be the same as Sheriff Dirkse, because a lot of the training is the same. A lot of it is developed, the curriculum is developed by POST, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training at the state of California. In addition, and I'm not going to speak for Sheriff Dirkse, I believe they went through it, I don't know. We've put our officers through the 21st century policing implicit bias training. We put the entire department through that. We continue to train on a regular basis. But some of the other questions when it comes to the training, and I'm not going to repeat everything that Sheriff Dirkse said, because a lot of it is the same. When it comes to looking back at how George Floyd died, and I've gotten these email questions of hog-tying or kneeling down on someone, and hog-tying is a technique that was used in the 80s. And those have not been trained on in years. In fact, when I started in the early 90s, we weren't trained on that. You're trained to actually take someone who's on their stomach and roll them onto their side, because it's hard to breathe when you're on their stomach. And if someone isn't fighting with you, you are to get them medical aid quickly, and understand that leaving them on their stomach makes it very difficult to breathe. So we already train on that, and I know the Sheriff's Department does as well. One of the scenarios in the academy has been in the past a brand new rookie officer who's still in the academy walks into a gymnasium and sees an officer using excessive force on someone, and they look to see what he's going to do, with the expectation that he will stop it. And so I'm proud of that training and the training that's happening at the academy, and I think that helps our department, and it helps our law enforcement in this county.
Thank you. So the follow-up question is from Simone. She says, where would residents be able to find information on the existing policies in the department related to the use of restraints, deadly force, and training on de-escalation? And then we'll ask the sheriff the same.
So very easily, if you just look Modesto PD online, it'll end up taking you to our webpage on the city's webpage. And then on the left side, there's a box that if you click inside the police department, a area will pop up that has all of our policies, It has all of our training, what we train on, what the curriculum is. It's all right on the internet or the website. I believe you can print it if you want to print it, but it's all right there for the public.
And we'll take the same question for the sheriff, and I can repeat it again. Where would residents be able to find information on the existing policies in the department related to the use of restraints, deadly force, and training on de-escalation?
And the answer is largely going to be the same. Go to the Sheriff's Department website. I can't talk you through exactly what box to click on off the top of my head. There is a search bar, though, if you search policies, if you can't find it easily. And again, actually from our homepage, you can email me directly, and I will be happy to provide you with a link or any follow-on questions that you may have.
Let's go to Darius. Darius, there's so much discussion, in the public square about what an appropriate response looks like. For example, this Facebook question from Carla: why take it out on innocent civilians? Why the looting and the vandalism? What are your thoughts there?
Well, again, people will have a tendency in every situation, because we're dealing with diverse characters in our communities, or whatever the case may be, to take advantage of a situation and to just end up doing something that benefits you, and it goes back to the thing that I said earlier, freedom demands responsibility. And when we lose contact with that, it will bring us right back to destruction and other things that happen, because we can be full of self when we respond to what we see in the community, and we cease to think family, and it will bring us right back to where we are.
We'll stick with you for just a moment. The Clergy Council hosted a prayer meeting at the police department this week to pray for our community. So a couple of questions came about, but first I wanted to ask you what that experience was like.
It was awesome. The thing is that I want to note is that that's not the first time that we did that, and it just happened to be something that was actually planned before we had the marches in our area. And for me, it wasn't a response to marches that were happening. It was something that the Clergy Council came together and decided that we needed to come together and pray. And we listed 7 items that we were going to pray for. Just real quick, the awesome thing about this relationship is with all 3 branches of law enforcement, we do have the ability to call them at any time for emergency meetings, called meetings, whatever the case may be. And we actually called Chief Carrol about planning that prayer meeting there. And so we did, and it was a blessing. I thought it was great. You had people who were driving by who maybe they thought it was a rally, and they began to blow their horns, and and then we see the same people coming back, and they park and get out and stand, and then they begin to take in what's going on. We wanted to make sure that we set the trend for what we felt we were there for. And so there was a lot of prayer that took place, and we appreciate that.
And what was the purpose of that prayer?
The purpose of that is to use, as what I called on that day, the most powerful weapon on the planet. And as I said, it's a weapon that is never misfired, and it never kills anyone. And that's the weapon called prayer. So we call on our matchless Creator to give us divine instructions and guidance and how and where we're going with a response to what's happening in our nation and our communities right now.
And just one more, because a couple of questions came from residents that want to get involved. So how can the faith community support you in this, and how can others get involved?
Well, obviously we have a protocol when we set meetings. Our awesome president, Pastor Charles Evans, there's a way in which we have to go through to even set up meetings and gatherings and things of that nature. But as I said, the evolution of this council has brought us to a place now where we will be posting information to help people with that. That gathering would have been 5 times larger than it was if we didn't keep our mindset on what we were trying to do. And then it would have brought in some items that wasn't a part of the plan that we were doing. But we do want to give the public the opportunity to participate with us, especially when you're talking about coming together to pray. And so that's where we are.
Here's a question for the sheriff from Mary Guzman. Are you going to protect your towns once criminals start looting?
Well, I think that the simplest answer to that is absolutely. And I think that every law enforcement agency in this community is going to step up and protect their community from really any crime. Now, we absolutely support and respect the right for people to have their voice and to protest. None of us are whatsoever opposed to that. But if it comes to criminal activity, of which looting clearly is one, then I think that there will be a swift response from the law enforcement in this county.
Well, it's 6:30, so I think we're out of time, but we wanted to give Reverend Crosby a chance to give some closing comments. What are your thoughts and feelings on race relations in our country and our community?
I think we are at a place where we need to realize that we can do more. We can do more, and we're just encouraging once again that we would arrange things that would help us to become more familiar with each other and always feel like we have more work to do. I think we need to leave this earth with that in mind. We always have more work to do to build, construct, and hold this family together. And so we just want to encourage people to move towards family at this time.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here tonight and taking part in this important community conversation.
And thank you all at home for sending in your questions. If we didn't get to your question tonight, we'll continue to answer them online in our updates on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
And as a reminder, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for the keywords Stan Emergency.
Thanks again, everyone. Have a safe and wonderful evening.